In Kurt Vonnegut's 1969 anti-war novel Slaughterhouse-Five, the protagonist, Billy Pilgrim, has a mantra that he repeats throughout the entirety of the narrative, which is, "So it goes." The saying is meant to elicit a fatalist perspective on the nature of life, believing that life is just a negative consequence and circumstances that are universally impacting each person on Earth, regardless of lived experiences. It's almost like a means to say, it is what it is. In comics, there's a similar saying that's sometimes attributed to Jack Kirby and other times attributed to Charles Schulz, and that saying is, "Comics will break your heart." It's used as shorthand to refer to the comics industry's exploitation of its creators since the dawn of comics, an experience that is all too common in its applicability towards creators and the career path of people working in the comics industry. Sometimes the quote is misinterpreted to say that stories within comics will break your heart, but it's just a ahistorical reading of the quote and the context surrounding it. So today I wanted to take a look at this quote and look at the historical context for why this sentiment is widely held even today. The quote being attributed to Jack Kirby was popularized by New Zealand cartoonist Dylan Horrocks in his comic Hicksville. Hicksville's premise is a fictionalized meta-narrative delving into the history and creation of comics, altering the paradigm for creators to be treated akin to pop culture celebrities. Horrocks spoke about the origin of this quote in a blog post on his website, with it stating, "In the 1980s, Romberger met Kirby at a convention in New York. Kirby kindly looked at Romberger's work and then gave him a piece of advice. Kid, you're one of the best. Put your work in galleries. Don't do comics. Comics will break your heart." Romberger followed Kirby's advice for years, mostly exhibiting in galleries while drawing comics for alternative and literary magazines, and occasionally for commercial publishers. On the side, when the first edition of 7 Miles a Second was published by Vertigo in 1996, Romberger mentioned in his artist's bio that he'd once been told by Jack Kirby, "Comics will break your heart." As soon as I read that, I knew I would have to use it in Hicksville. I'm grateful to Romberger for later sharing the full story with me, and I urge you all to buy his and Wojornowicz's extraordinary book. As I was saying earlier, Charles Schulz has a similar quote that goes, "Cartooning will destroy you. It will break your heart." This quote was popularized by Chris Ware in an issue of Acme Novelty Library, although the original source for this quote remains undetermined. In the article covering the history of the quote and the origins thereof, Heidi MacDonald for Comics Beat stated,
"As you can see from the context, it was perhaps not the idea of working in comics itself that Kirby was warning against, but the idea of a fine artist like Romberger, whose work is in the Museum of Modern Art, trying to break into a sweatshop like comics where such talents weren't needed." This doesn't really change the meaning of the quote, but the slant is a tiny bit different. James Romberger is still around, so maybe we'll get the full story from him in another post. This, on the other hand, sounds like the most Charles Schulz-like quote possible. It was Schulz's endless exploration of failure, loss, and heartbreak that made Peanuts the literary classic it is. I know I've written about this before, but I interviewed Schulz once over the phone, and when he mentioned the inspiration for Snoopy, he got a sad note in his voice and told me how much he missed the dog who had died 50 years before. The man didn't let go, it seems. Will comics break your heart? Oh yes. But so will anything else worth dreaming and achieving. It's in the space between risk and reality that the magic can happen. Jack Kirby warned us that comics will break your heart is an essential station of the myth, because comics' greatest visionary warned us of the danger implying that he himself had a broken heart. It's quite likely that he did, but I'm also pretty sure that Jack Kirby lived to draw and create. It was a price he had to pay. Was the payoff worth it? I'll leave that to you to decide.
In response to this article, Mark Evanier, writer of Kirby, King of Comics, which is thought to be the definitive biography of Jack Kirby, also responded to the claims made by Heidi MacDonald. He personally vouched for being present during the times that Jack would say this to incoming fans, as well as people desperate to break into the comics industry. Evanier specifically stated, "I heard him say it, though not directly to me. When I met Jack, I had no expectation of working in comics or working in comics as much as I eventually did. What he said to me was more in the nature of encouragement to keep thinking of comics as something to do for a while before moving on to other things. But I heard him say the line or variations of it to others, mostly kids who approached him at San Diego cons. I can't give you any of their names because I think they all took his advice. Well, some of them did. Around 1971, a young artist named Wendy Fletcher visited him and showed him her drawings. I don't think he said the break your heart line to her, but he told her not to get into comics, urged her to pursue other illustration work and gallery showings, as he did to Romberger, and told her, if I catch you working in comics, I'll spank you. Wendy did later work in comics. After she married Richard Peeney, she became Wendy Peeney. They created and she drew ElfQuest and other wonderful things. Jack did not spank her. I think he may have congratulated her for doing such fine work and retaining ownership of it. There were many variations of his advice. He especially urged folks he thought were talented to not see drawing someone else's creation for DC or Marvel as a career. I should also point out that Jack's advice fluctuated. There were times he was happier in the field than he was at other times. When he did say things like that, it came from a frustration not from the form of comics, which he loved, but the working conditions, bad compensation, a loss of control of one's work he encountered. He probably said it much less, if at all, in the last years of his life when he could see creators sometimes holding on to copyrights and making real good money in comics. And I doubt he was ever as dour as the above drawing by New Zealand cartoonist Dylan Horrocks made him out to be. He usually said things with a feisty, defiant manner. Jack was a pretty feisty, defiant guy. The sentiment that was expressed by Jack Kirby wasn't unique to him either, but instead just an identification of the history of disputes between comic publishers and the creators in their employ. In the Superman video that I released last year, I talk about the creation of Superman from its creators of Siegel and Schuster. Superman is the first official iteration of a superhero, and went on to define Western comics as a genre all the way until today. Once the comic publisher saw that the book was successful, they immediately enforced their ownership over Superman as an IP, leaving Siegel and Schuster to battle in court to receive their royalties due based on their own creation. With this in mind, it's a foregone conclusion to say that superhero comics are defined by their relationship to their creators being improperly compensated. As superheroes rose to prominence, publishers began their attainment of characters as intellectual property. This would leave creators unaccredited and unable to obtain the proprietorship of their creation. If they wished to reobtain the rights of their creation, they would need to pursue legal action against the comic publishers. However, the publishers would have insurmountable leverage and capital over those creators. Over 30 years after the creation of Superman, Marvel Comics as we know it to be today rose to prominence. At the forefront would be Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and Larry Lieber. This Marvel renaissance reignited the demand for superhero stories. With this newfound readership came exponential sales growth for Marvel as a whole. A comic publisher once thought to be on its last leg have been given new life by its creators overseeing the titles produced. However, behind the scenes, tensions grew over the distribution of royalties. But to explain this, we must first talk about the nature of their creative process, dubbed the Marvel Method. From all accounts, the artists would meet with Stan to discuss the plot of the following issue, with notes being taken for various plot beats originating from these discussions. The artists would then take these notes back and begin illustrating the following issue, formulating the layout for each page. After the art had come in with the completed pages, Stan would then provide the dialogue and narration that would make it to the final product. The Marvel Method would require the artist to not only pace the story to conform to the page count, but also to direct the progression of the entire narrative. It's a matter of historical record that Kirby would include dialogue suggestions in the margins of his pages, along with explaining which moments are vital to each issue.
Jack was about the best. He was really the most creative artist of all. He was more than an artist. I call him a great conceptualizer. He could conceive of stories and follow them through. All I would have to do with Jack is give him a very brief outline of what to do, and he would just do the whole story. And after a while, when we were rushed, I didn't even give him an outline. He just do whatever story he wanted, and I'd come back and put in the copy.
Taking this into consideration, the role of the artist carried about 75% of the creative input, and yet the compensation paid to the illustrators was that of an equal 50-50 split between their labor and Stan's writing. Each of the original artists grew to become disgruntled in the lopsided nature of labor produced versus the royalties received, with each later disparaging Stan Lee's unwillingness to unify with them and his later comments that would be in service to reduce the importance of the artist in the creation process. For years, the name Stan Lee has been synonymous with Marvel Comics, and that's by design. Throughout his life, Stan had made himself the carnival barker for Marvel Comics, much to the chagrin of his peers. Through this, he would be able to propagate notions that he was the sole creator of Marvel's characters, leaving artists out in the dust to the sands of time. This time at Marvel would be crucial in understanding the quote from Jack Kirby, with it amplifying the turmoil of creating with no avenues of recourse against claims of lessened importance. Over the course of his career, Jack's main goal was to provide for his family. His constant fear of failure led to a pronounced work ethic, which he believed would result in equitable remuneration. Instead, comic publishers identified his lack of business sense and took advantage of it, making endless promises for increased page rates, royalties received, and business opportunities that never came to pass. Before making the jump from Marvel to DC during this time, Jack would be courted over by Carmine Infantino, who promised to be a man of his word in approving all of Jack's requests. A microcosm of the inability to acquiesce to the aforementioned deals would take the form of the Fourth World and Spirit World. When he agreed to leave Marvel, Jack was tasked with reinvigorating the DC line and bringing the same level of bombastic stories. He was given carte blanche by Infantino to craft the stories he wanted to tell with no restrictions. Kirby saw the success over at Marvel being a result of an expanded readership in demographics of college-aged adults. He believed to further cultivate this audience, they would benefit from crafting narratives with a refined maturity and themes. This is evident in his Fourth World saga, with running themes of the younger generation rising to take on the second wave of fascism. He blatantly attributed the creation of the Forever People to be a result of the Flower Power movement in opposition to Vietnam. Alongside the Fourth World, Kirby pitched to revitalize DC's horror comics line, specifically cultivating a prestige-bound magazine that would be established to further the potential appeal to a wider demographic and breaking the notion of comics only being for children. The book was greenlit, with every accommodation made to the specifications of Kirby's requests, and yet when it came time to publish the comic, every aspect that defined the characteristics of the magazine had been stripped just prior to release, cutting the potential future of the book at the knees. Jack was operating in the comics industry for over 40 years, and every opportunity led to unkept promises, stagnant pay, and diminished recognition. With this as the historical context, no wonder Jack had complex emotions to the comics industry. I mean, as the name suggests, it operates as an industrial production of comics, with the creators being relegated to cogs in that process. Even with a creator that was foundational in the popularization of comics, the business will operate as it does, churning out the creatives in a way that serves the publisher as a feature and not a bug. It wasn't until Jack Kirby left comics, returning to animation, where he felt he was properly recognized for his labor and the work that was produced previously. Although he would sporadically contribute to comics over time, it wasn't until his work for DC's Superpowers line, spawning a television show and action figures, would he gain what he believed to be the due royalties from his contributions. Recently, I was able to go to a comic shop and pick up one of the things that I've been trying to get my hands on forever, which is Will Eisner's Shop Talk, which has Will Eisner interviewing various comic creators and legends in the medium talking about their history and their careers throughout time. And I gotta say, I've just been captivated by it. I mean, obviously considering how many notes I've taken. But I honestly just want to highlight one passage from the interview between Will Eisner and Jack Kirby. In their interview, I was able to pull various quotes, and I feel like it was very insightful into understanding both creators' perception of their careers and the comics industry at large. In his conversation with Will Eisner, Jack Kirby said, "I began to do monster books, the kind of books Goodman wanted. I had to fight for the superheroes. In other words, I was at a stage now where I had to fight for those things, and I did. I had to regenerate the entire line. I felt that there was nobody there who was qualified to do it, so I began to do it. Stan Lee was my vehicle to do it. He was my bridge to Martin Goodman."
I take it he believed in what you had to say.
Stan Lee always believed in what I had to say. I know Stan Lee better than any man. Stan Lee had a lot of faith in me. He knew I'd been successful in the past, and he knew I'd be successful now. Stan was my bridge between myself and Martin.
And the stuff that you worked on with Stan, was he writing at the time?
No, Stan Lee was not writing. I was doing the writing. It all came from my basement, and I can tell you that if I ever began to intellectualize, it was then.
What do you mean by intellectualize?
Well, I was more mature now. My characters were more mature, and that made them different. I didn't realize I was building a college audience. When I created the Hulk, they wanted to discontinue it after 3 issues. What saved me was the fact that some Columbia students came up to Marvel, and they had along a whole list of names. They said the Hulk was the mascot of their dormitory. It was the first time I realized we had a college audience. I told everybody at Marvel not to discontinue this book. I said a book needs time to mature, just like people.
When you say intellectualize, I'm fascinated. I want to see if we can probe that definition. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but...
No, I began to define characters.
Give me an example.
Okay, I'll give you Dr. Doom, who is one of my characters. Dr. Doom is a handsome guy. But first I began with the classics that were very powerful. What comics were doing all the time was updating the classics. So I borrowed from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I felt there was a Mr. Hyde in all of us, and that was a character I wanted, and I called him the Hulk. In the Legend of Thor, I began to update. I felt that Thor needed friends, so I went to the 4 Musketeers, and that was the basis. I began to feel that people had problems. One man needed friends. The Hulk was misunderstood by people. He was a schizophrenic. He was misunderstood. He became Dr. Bruce Banner at one point, an intellectual, and then he became a primitive at another point. I was updating Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Bruce Banner was a physicist. He was no longer a doctor, and I did that with the others. I began to realize that I knew about people. Dr. Doom was a perfectionist. Dr. Doom was a handsome guy, and he had to hide his face in a steel mask because he had a scratch on his face. He couldn't stand that scratch.
So you were applying psychology, or a human understanding, for you, a new dimension, right?
Yes, I began to learn that I knew people. I finally began to know the other guy. When I began to learn that I knew the other guy, then I began my best work.
Now, we're coming to the point where Marvel or Stan Lee is listening to your advice, or your driving push, for a better approach to comics, which you felt was attractive to the college audience. The last time I saw Stan Lee, it must have been a few years ago, he showed me some pages that Marvel was doing and explained the way he was working. He said, and you weren't being discussed at this point, he'd discuss a story with someone, give them an outline of the plot. They'd bring in the whole story in light pencil form, and then he, or whoever, would write in the balloons. Then the pencils would be inked. He asked me what I thought of it, and I told him that personally, I didn't like working that way. But after all, he was producing and selling millions of comic books. And for him, and the owners of Marvel, that was the name of the game. Not much room for argument, given that premise.
Yeah, I think Stan is naive in his own way.
Did you guys work that way?
Stan Lee wouldn't let me fill in the balloons. Stan Lee wouldn't let me put in the dialogue. But I wrote the entire story under the panels. I never explained the story to Stan Lee. I wrote that story under each panel so that when he wrote the dialogue, the story was already there. In other words, he didn't know what the story was about, and he didn't care because he was busy being an editor. I was glad because he was doing the same thing Joe did. He left me alone. I believe that the quote, "comics will break your heart," and the life of Jack Kirby stands as a Rorschach test for people understanding the history of the comics industry. Of course, there's this juvenile interpretation that comics make you sad, but if you interrogate the history of the medium with Jack Kirby in mind, you begin to understand the melancholic appreciation for comics. Comics are not for the faint of heart, and will routinely diminish the creators in the process, but you cannot have your heart broken if you didn't love something in the first place. We must acknowledge the roles that creators play in our appreciation of the medium. While superheroes are able to rake in billions of dollars in profit for adaptations, the creators of said characters will never see a percentage of those royalties. It's important that creators are highlighted in this process, because the experience of Jack Kirby doesn't need to be an inevitability, and the only method of comics correcting the failures of previous generations of creators is to make that change with the current generation. While the original quote can be viewed as a fatalistic interpretation of the comics industry, I think we should see it as a rallying cry for creators owning their creations and backing the importance of comic creators for their work produced. I mean, at the end of the day, there isn't a comic without comic creators. Alright, that's going to be enough out of me. If you like this video, give it a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. And I want to thank Korinzik and all of my supporters over on Patreon. Thank you for continuing to support me and letting me make videos like these. And if you too want to support the channel, you can go to the Patreon and subscribe for as low as $1 per month. And one last thing, go read some comics, or else.